What is going on, guys? Happy Monday for everyone listening on YouTube and Tuesday for everyone that catches us on Spotify and the other podcast platforms. Today is Brian and myself, and we are chatting personalizing your training volume. So this came through as a question from our episode 164 August Instagram Q&A. The question was how to estimate optimal volume as in sets per week for an individual. And we thought it would make a wonderful question to explode into an entire episode. And here we are for episode 167. So Brian and I have laid out some important considerations, both things that are very, very practical X's and O's inside of the gym, as well as other impacting lifestyle factors outside of the gym that goes into how you can find the best way to personalize your training volume. Before we dive into this, we have some updates. As always, Brian, can you kick us off, please?
Yeah, so my update is actually an update to my training program, to Brian's program. And it's well-timed because part of the reason why my program is changing is a potential new understanding of maybe what optimal training volume is for me. So I'm not going to give it all away here in my updates as to exactly why. I can discuss that more in the body of the episode, but suffice to say that this bike season has been extremely eye-opening for me. I've kind of talked week to week as we've gone through this about how surprised I am that I'm still able to progress so well in the gym. This has been since March when bike season started. And every week I feel like I'm coming on being like, I progressed this or I progressed that. Or a couple weeks ago, I noted how my body weight hasn't dropped at all throughout this bike season and how that may be playing a factor in my ability to progress. But one of the staples that has been present the entire bike season has been that I've used such a lower frequency and lower volume approach than what I've done in prior years. Combine the incredible success that I've had over the last 6 months lifting weights, along with my reintroduction to abbreviated training, which, as I've discussed in prior episodes, is kind of how I got my start in training. In the first 2 or 3 years of my training journey, I fell into what was called like a HIIT, high intensity training, not high intensity interval training, but high intensity training. Mike Menser, Arthur Jones were really the big ones that popularized this approach, which was infrequent, high intensity, low volume training. Over the years, it's kind of been shifted a little bit through a brand called Hard Gainer, which promotes drug-free trainees to train hard with full body or upper lower splits 2 to 3 days a week. So this is kind of how I got my start, and I've been reintegrating back into this culture a little bit. Found a Facebook group that had a lot of the old people that I was learning from when I was 16, 17, 18 years old. And now they have this Facebook group. And so between falling back in with them a little bit, seeing these incredible results that I've been having with the lower volume, lower frequency approach during bike season, I made the decision to double down on low volume, low frequency. And my thought process being that if it worked so well while I'm also doing cardio 5 times a week, imagine how well it must work if I'm in an even more recovered state. And so it's another experiment. We had a question on a Q&A a couple weeks ago about what is my next experiment? And I didn't really have any ideas. And then this came to me and I was like, this is what I want my experiment to be. And so the new program that I'm going to be starting literally this week is 4 full body sessions over a 10 to 12 day period. So think 1 full body session every 2 to 3 days. I'm planning it out to be kind of like a Monday, Thursday, Sunday, Wednesday, Saturday type thing. So that would be like 12 or 13 days to get through 4 full body sessions. And it's relatively low volume, focusing on big compound movements, really trying to just push progression week to week, whether it's adding a rep or micro loading in some ways, depending on the movement. And that will be available in the app under Brian's Program 2. So we have Brian's Program, which is just going to be my interpretation of the evidence and evidence-based optimal training in my view. And then Brian's Program 2 is what I'm actually doing. And in this case, it's not really evidence-based per se, based on what the literature would say about sets per body part and things like that. So it's an experiment, and we'll see how it goes. And I'm just kind of excited for that journey to go forward from there. So, yeah, Aaron, jump on in, buddy.
I have a great question. Well, at least I think it's a great question. How are you, for this experiment, going to quantify efficacy?
Yes.
I guess let me extrapolate it a little bit more. I guess, what is the desired outcome? Are we just monitoring training performance? Is there a body composition or muscle retention build aspect of it? What are you planning to do there?
Yeah, I don't really think that there's any way to accurately assess body composition given the perils that we had with my most recent DEXA scan coming back at 21.4% body fat. And I just don't believe it. And so I don't think that DEXA is a great use of trying to assess body comp in somebody that is advanced as me. And the gains that would be made are going to be so marginal anyways that it's likely beyond the error that the DEXA would be able to pick up on. So I think that, we kind of touched on this discussion either last week or the week before, where you had kind of noted that training performance was going to be one of the key factors. And then I kind of poked at you, played a little devil's advocate and said, well, what if volumes are really low? What if rep ranges are lower than the hypertrophy rep range? Like, there's a lot of extenuating circumstances that make performance a difficult metric to use to assess hypertrophy progress. But I think in this case, that is likely the best that I have. And so, like, if I'm seeing my big compound movements going up with form staying the same over the course of the next 6 months and the trend line increases, and I'm training in hypertrophy rep ranges, which will primarily be between 5 and 10 reps for most things, then I do think that that's the best correlation that I'm going to have. I also do understand the argument that my volumes are going to be lower than the standard evidence-based recommendation. For example, I'm only going to be training biceps once every 10 to 12 days and triceps once every 10 to 12 days, and with 2 to 3 sets for each. So we're literally talking about not even hitting the lower end of what the evidence-based recommendation would be for that. But then also understanding that when you do take evidence-based recommendations, they count compound movements as arm work. So doing a bench press counts as a tricep exercise, and doing a pull-up counts as a bicep exercise as much as it counts as a back or a chest exercise. So in that way, my arms are going to be hitting close to the evidence-based recommendations, but still across the board, like, the volume is going to be quite low. You won't see me hitting more than 4 sets, maybe 5 sets of chest in a week, no more than 4 or 5 sets of hamstrings in a week, or quads or anything like that. So the volume will be low. Performance is likely the best proxy that I have. But it is possible that the strength is increasing because the fatigue is low due to the lower volume approach. And, at this point of my journey, if my strength is increasing in hypertrophy rep ranges, I'm going to consider that a huge win. I'm not going to say that means that I'm gaining muscle, but I am going to say that that's what the desired outcome is at this point.
Perfect. Yeah, I wouldn't, if I was doing that experiment and someone asked me the question I asked you, like, I wouldn't really know how to answer it. I do think there's a likely area where volume is low, but we have such good recoverability that, like, training, can progress each week, but it may not be like a sufficient enough stimulus for the growth. But like, we just, I truly think we're in an area we just don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the powerlifters and stuff, they train pretty low volume, and I think generally they do, hypertrophy over it, but it's just not the goal. I think it's yeah, I don't know. I'm very excited to listen along and watch along and see how it goes for you. Because
Thanks,
yeah,
man. Yeah, I at this point, I don't even know if you could say that there's any way that we'd be able to accurately assess whether I've gained muscle in 6 months. Like I could be following a high volume program that ticks every box of the evidence-based sphere, and I'm doing 20 sets of this and 16 sets of that, and I'm at 2 RIR and blah, 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 and I'm doing all of these things. And it's like, hey, based on paper, this program should optimize your hypertrophy. But how do I know that it is? Like, in some ways, you might actually say that that program would lead to less strength increase, less performance increase because volume is higher, recoverability will be lower. You might not actually increase in strength as much, but evidence would say that that program may lead to better hypertrophy. So how then, at that case, do you even assess whether that's working if strength isn't even a metric that you are using per se? So I think the whole thing is very complicated and nebulous, especially as you get higher in training age.
I really think the only true way to do it is like you run it, you get to a body fat, or sorry, I guess technically a body fat percentage, but like a body weight that you've been before. Remember, that's like your 185 or whatever, and it's like, how do I look? Like
Yes.
I really think that's the only true way that you can really do it, but it's very involved and has many
Yeah.
moving pieces, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll just see how that goes. Like if it's going well after 6 months, then maybe at that point I'm like, hey, maybe I'll try a deficit, see if I can get my body weight down. Like I'm not going to jump into a deficit right off the bat and be like, I'm lowering volume, lowering frequency, and I'm going to drop body weight and let's just see what happens. So I'm going
Yeah.
to try and keep body weight the same, but kind of let the training do the talking.
Yep. Yeah, I love it. I'm
Yeah.
excited to hear about it.
Cool. What's up with you?
A couple updates. First, I have some coaching roster spots open, so I have some clients wrapping up this month, and I always like to give those spots first to podcast listeners, and then my progress squad on Instagram, which I'll be posting that in there as well. So if you're interested, reach out. I would love to chat about that. Second, this is a big one. I was purposefully pretty silent about this because it was my first time and I did not know if it would be a disaster or not. So I took the choice of just working in silence and then seeing how things went. But I had my first bodybuilding client get on stage. This is also something where I've spoken many times about in my professional career. I guess I don't like coaching things that I don't have direct experience in because it's hard. I don't like asking something of someone that I haven't personally done myself. But this was a little bit of a different situation where female, we were going through a calorie deficit for like a photo shoot she wanted to do. And then after that, she was like, there's this bodybuilding show in 6 weeks. I think I want to do it. Will you coach me into it? And I was like, I will jump on this opportunity. So we did. Things went very, very well. First show for her, first show for me. We took 2 class wins and a third place in a novice class. And she made it into an overall in her first show. So things went very, very well, especially for a very short, prep and her learning to pose and all that stuff in 6 weeks. So I was quite pleased with our outcomes. It was a lot of fun of just you don't get to use some of the skills with so many of clients. So it's fun getting to play like a very, soul acute, intricate level game where you're like manipulating these very minor details and those sorts of things. So it was very, very good. I'm happy, very, very happy with the outcomes. So is she. So that was a very, very cool first experience. I will post up
That
on my Instagram and stuff for if anyone wants to have a look at that.
Yeah, dude, I'm super intrigued by all of this because I remember in the past you saying kind of exactly what you said, which is that, you didn't want to coach somebody to do something that you haven't done yourself. And then also on top of that, that it was a female, because I feel like you've been somewhat vocal in the past about how you primarily work with males. And I noticed that that had been changing as well over the last few months. I've seen you post a little bit more about some of your female clients. So it's cool that not only did you get to take someone to stage for the first time, but it also was a female and that it turned out so successful. And she had a cutout cardboard figure of you, which was also super cool.
Yeah, around last I'm trying to think. No, it's been over a year now. Probably about a year and a half ago, I started taking on some female clients. The first was actually Rachel Gregory, who we both
Mm-hmm.
know.
Yep.
And the way that she presented it to me, I just couldn't say no. I felt like it would have been almost like an insult to say no to her, but I laid it out and I was like, hey, these are the things that I need from you. I want this information. And it went really, really well. And I've decided to like, for a certain select people who were a little bit more advanced, like at that time, all of my female clients were other coaches. So they were familiar with the game and those sorts of things. And since I've expanded, and it really has come full circle, if I'm really honest, probably if I were to pick my 10 favorite clients, probably like 7 or 8 of them are females. And I think it too is my positioning in the space now that I wouldn't say more mature, but I have matured in my existence in this space. People, before someone signs up with me, they kind of know what I'm about and those sorts of things by this point. So I think I can attract people who are more closely aligned with the way that I do things. And that's a lot different than the way that I did things in the past. But it has been really, really fun. It just getting to do some different things, getting to help people who are kind of different demographics that I'm typically used to in playing. And I just get to learn a lot too. For a large portion of my clientele, I'm not really learning new things at this point anymore. Like there are a lot of the same avatars, but with this bikini prep, it was a lot of learning new things. So it was a great experience for the both of us, and I'm happy about it.
Yeah, super cool to push yourself outside of that comfort zone and get the new experience.
Yeah. And then the last thing is my training is fully back, minus legs. I haven't put in RDLs or bilateral squat pattern. I'll probably put in the bilateral squat pattern this week. But like setting PRs, chest, back, delts, it's cool that I'm doing that again. It's been happening faster than I had thought, which has been a lot of fun.
Nice. Are you going to veer away from, it was the leg press that caused the hernia, right?
Yes. At least I think so. It could have been a Bulgarian split squat, which I also did that day. Could have been a seated leg curl. I don't know precisely, but I would imagine of the exercises that day, it was the leg press. Yeah.
That's my guess too. So are you going to stick with like a pendulum or a hack instead for the time being?
Yeah. We have the Arsenal leg press here, but it's just, I get a much better stimulus on the pendulum anyway, so that'll go in.
I feel like a leg press has you in a much more compromised position to get a hernia than either of those movements as well. Like the way that I brace through that movement and how hard you have to push from the bottom in that like super crunched up position, it just seems like the perfect movement to cause a hernia in my mind.
Agreed. It does feel that way too. Even with like a hack squat, I don't feel that same kind of like pressure in that area. Yeah.
Yes. Cool.
And that's it for me.
All right. Well, we are talking about personalizing your training volume today. And so we have a few categories of different topics that we want to go through that will impact how to best find your training volume. And so I think the very first one that came to mind as soon as we, saw this question and began discussing this topic is progression happening? And so this kind of goes back to the discussion we had during the updates when we were talking about my new training program just 5 or 10 minutes ago. Is progression happening? And is progression a reliable metric that you can use to assess hypertrophy? And I think it's a little bit ambiguous. Like it's not fully straightforward, but I do think that some sort of progression should be happening. Like your volume shouldn't be so high that it's muting or diminishing your recovery so much that you're unable to progress. Like nobody would say, yeah, dude, you're right there in the hypertrophy zone because you're not making any progress. You're doing enough volume. Good work. I think that's probably too much volume. And so there should be an amount of volume where you can progress. And then as long as you're progressing, I think there's some variation in there as far as which volumes may or may not produce the best hypertrophy for you. Like as a hypothetical, you could be doing 10 sets for a body part and making progress, or you could be doing 16 sets for a body part and also making progress. But one of those volumes could potentially be better for you but the basis of that being that you have to choose a volume where at least you're making progress. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the when you were explaining the progress, I think proxy is a really, really good term to use, because
Mm-hmm.
proxies are typically correlative, but not inherently causative. Um, and it's the most straightforward way to kind of gauge progress. Like, am I progressing? Am I adding reps? And then over a couple of weeks, is weight coming up? I think that's really, really good. And if it's not, it could lead you to think it's a very plausible to be like, well, do I need more or do I need less? And then that can unfold into some other aspects that we have outlined here as to which may be the best help in helping you decide whether you need more or less.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that like there are multiple progression models out there and ways that you can go about seeing or eliciting progress in your training. And so like the most straightforward, obvious way would just be, am I week to week able to add a rep, add a pound or two? Am I seeing this trend line kind of go up over time? But I think a very popular way to go about training, and one that I tend to use, is the more wave approach, which would be that, you spend 4 to 6 weeks progressing up, slightly increasing RIRs, working a little bit harder week to week, adding, 2 to 5 pounds a week, and then taking a reset of some sort. It doesn't have to be a deload, but kind of almost as if you're stair stepping, going like 4 steps forward, 2 steps back, 4 steps forward, 2 steps back. And so like I love that type of progression, and I use that almost exclusively with clients. So in that case, it's like we're not necessarily comparing week to week. Like, yes, we do want to see some progress week to week as we're working harder, getting closer to failure, whatever the stipulation is. But what we really want is we want like week 5 of mesocycle 1 to be better, or we want week 5 of mesocycle 2 to be better than week 5 of mesocycle 1. So it's not that we're comparing directly week 3 to week 4 to week 5, but we're comparing the same week across different mesocycles. And for someone who's advanced, who isn't going to see progress week to week like an intermediate would, or a beginner, as an advanced person, progress is slower, and so you need to look at it over a longer time frame. And so this kind of like wave-like or stair-stepping approach of going forward and coming back and going forward and coming back, but always ending up at a higher place at the end, I think is also a very reasonable way of kind of going about this.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us into the second thing we had here, was just training age, right? Because I think as your training age increases and as you develop some, let's call them for what they are, imbalances between different muscles for a variety of reasons, injury, some muscles you're just going to have an inherent better like mind muscle connection with from maybe playing sport or just genetic, proclivities, those sorts of things. You may need to individualize your volume across different body parts, because of some of those. So as your training age increases, the likelihood of needing some increased personalization also does increase.
Yeah, that's such a good point, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think it bridges us into the topic of specialization, which is something that isn't necessary at earlier training ages, but is at later training ages, and that has a direct impact on the amount of volume that you use. And this has been a topic we've discussed before. We've kind of noted how the data-driven strength guys discuss this topic quite a bit as well, and that they're huge fans of this process of oscillating or alternating between different focus muscle groups. And so it complicates this question of what is the optimal training volume for me, or personalizing your training volume, because that number actually could change depending on what muscle group is being prioritized, which may actually turn out to be the most optimal way to go about achieving the various volumes that will elicit the most optimal growth across various body parts. And so I think the idea of saying, here's 2 or 3 body parts and we're going to ramp the volume up almost above evidence-based recommendations for a brief period of time can be very productive, especially when that's combined with a lowering of volume of the muscle groups that are not your primary target for that period of time. Which, like, I love this idea. Have you implemented something like this in your training, or are you still pretty evenly distributed across the board?
Oh no, my current back volume is astronomically higher than everything else.
Okay. How long has that been for?
February, maybe, when I
Yeah,
started
so
this
we're
program.
like 8 or 9,
Maybe March, maybe
9 months.
maybe no, probably mid-March. But
Okay.
it's important to realize there was a solid 2-month chunk in the middle right in train.
Right.
And then,
Right.
what I decided was I would know that I was back from my injury when my training was equal or better to my prior performances.
Are you spending that extra effort and volume on back because of the nature of it being short overloaded, which is another thing we'll get into here as assessing volume, but is it because it's less stimulative per set than some other body parts and movements? Oh, because like in my mind, you've always stated that your legs are your weak point. Like my legs are my quads and my hamstrings. These are the things that I really need to work on. So why is it that you decided to spend the last, 6 to 8 months specializing on back?
Because I decided that I would compete in men's physique. And as much as I don't like this answer, but my immediate primary goal is to build a physique so that I can compete for this small, amount of time. And my personal preferences of how I would actually like to train, it would just be silly to do so. I'd be doing myself a disservice in pursuit of having a good placement in men's physique. I just don't need any more legs, to be completely honest. And my back was kind of the area that needed the most work for the, division of men's physique, and that's why.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes total sense. And so then that gets into another question, or not question, but another kind of issue as we talk about personalizing your training volume, which is not just what muscle is your weakest muscle, but for what purpose are you trying to grow that muscle? And so, yeah, it's a very complicated question. And I guess to kind of bring it back to the second topic that we're in right now, which is training age, is that these focuses, these individual focuses on specific muscle groups for growth are something that really you don't have to worry about until it becomes relevant. And if you want to really delve into volume over training age, then our last episode is the one you want to listen to. So I think instead of us belaboring the discussion of training age too much right now, I'll just refer you back to episode 166, which was last week's episode. And we talk about training volume over training age for literally 45 minutes. So anything else to add to kind of that discussion before we move on here?
No, let's move into the next point.
Yeah, so next we have effort, or RIR, like reps in reserve, how close to failure you're training, stuff like that. And that is perpetually linked to volume. Another thing that we discussed a bit last week, and we've discussed many times over in prior episodes, has been this inverse relationship between volume and effort, where you could probably do 30 sets per muscle group per week if you're training at 5 RIR or whatever for each exercise. But as soon as that effort begins to ramp up, and now you're somebody that maybe is training to complete failure with partials and with forced reps and drop sets, and I don't even know, like just adding in all the different intensity techniques that you can throw at something, then that mitigates the amount of volume that you could do. And so there's that relationship between those two that cannot be separated. And there isn't necessarily, at least according to evidence, a best way of going about this. Like I literally think that you can look at the evidence and say that you could, in theory, do 20 or 30 sets of 3 to 5 RIR across every set, or you could do something like 10 sets where every set is taken, to 1 or 0 RIR. And both of those at a grand population level will likely get you to the same place. However, individually, there's likely one that is better for you than the other. And so how do you go about parsing out for yourself and with clients whether this client is somebody that may respond to higher volumes with lower efforts, or whether this is somebody that responds to lower volumes with higher efforts?
Yeah, and I love that this is the place in the conversation where we're going to start to intersect some of the non-gym mediated factors. And the real answer to that, or that I start with, is like, what does our schedule demands look like? What is our time commitment, right? Maybe we only have 40 minutes in the gym 4 days per week, right? We're going to do those intensity techniques and those sorts of things because we don't have the luxury of time to run 4 sets or 5 sets or something like that. We're going to do rest pause sets, so I think this is another important consideration that often gets missed, in these kind of conversations, is what other, unfortunately, right? Many people don't just have the luxury of training whenever they want, as many days as they want, for as many hours as they want. They have other important, commitments in their life that are a higher priority. And that's where, the beauty of understanding some of these things, and we can ramp intensity down if we have more time, right? Or if we have a lower recovery capacity, maybe we have like a kind of sensitive CNS. And if we take sets to failure, we start getting like really dizzy and then energy problems. Maybe I've met people who are just these kind of genetic anomalies with blood glucose. And if they train too hard, they go hypo and they have to just keep shuttling like carbs in. Like, there are people like this. Depends. So I love at this point, we start bringing in like, well, realistically, how many days per week can we train and what kind of time commitment? And then we back in from there. So I think what helps maybe is we use a kind of an avatar and frame out, maybe we have 4 days realistically per week, 60 minutes, which I feel like is a pretty good kind of baseline for a lot of people. I personally like to keep almost anyone at about a 2 RIR, at the furthest away from failure. If it's someone very, very new, very green, I will give them rep numbers and be like, hey, I want you to hit 8 reps, and then we're going to increase weight. Because with that new novice trainee, they're going to pick, okay, 8 reps, I'm going to do, 20 pounds, where realistically they could probably do like 45, but it's a learning curve for them. So we're going to give them like that runway of finding their strength and just keeping it easy and saying 8 reps sort of thing. So it really depends on, I know we moved away from training age, but the other indirect impacting factors that go into how much time we realistically can contribute to it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think 4 times a week at 60 minutes per session is kind of that point where it does need to veer closer to intensity because you just don't have enough time to do tons of volume, especially if you're taking sufficient rest between sets, which is actually like another mitigating factor of volume that we've covered before, but probably worth mentioning again, in that if you're resting longer between sets, you're able to work harder on each set and get more out of each set. Whereas if you're trying to do higher volumes, you have to rest less, sort of almost as a result of trying to fit the higher volumes in. Do you have a sense of what would be more fatiguing for somebody, assuming time wasn't an issue? Like somebody is doing 20 sets at 3 RIR or doing 10 sets, pretty close to failure. Like which one do you feel like would be causing more fatigue for like a general client?
The first one was 20 sets at
3 RIR, yeah.
Okay.
Or
and
10 sets close to 10 sets basically at failure, close to failure.
Honestly, I think the 20, and the reason I think is it's not so much like the direct systemic kind of fatigue, but more of like the mental fatigue, the boredom that kind of sets in, like keeping your head in the game. Like most of the people that I have coached towards like training closer to failure, it's daunting over like the first 9 or 10 days. And then it just kind of becomes your norm. And then you adapt to that pretty quickly. But I do find even myself, like I love training, But the days where, especially like small muscle groups that I don't really love, I'm kind of like, once I get like 60% of the way through the training session, I'm kind of like losing my focus between my sets and stuff. And I kind of really just want to get out of there. So I think like the mental fatigue would start to creep in as the volumes get really, really high. So that's how I would answer that.
What about the mental fatigue or this psychological fatigue of anxiety associated with having to go to failure on, these big compound movements? Like, that feeling of, man, I'm in week 5 of my hack squat progression and I barely eked out my goal last week. And now the coach wants me to add 2.5 pounds and hit that same number again. And it's fucking driving me insane. And I like couldn't sleep last night because I'm so nervous about the set that I have to do.
Well, if it's like that, I would implore you to have a conversation with your coach around maybe some lessening some expectations that he or she has of you. If you can't sleep at night because of the act.
Well, I mean, maybe that's a little bit too far of a push,
Okay.
but like you wake up in the morning and you're already thinking about that session, and it's kind of like it's infiltrating your mind and distracting you from other things.
Yeah, it is real. I get that. Like tomorrow is my leg session and it's, by far the hardest one. I don't think it's objectively a bad thing. There's, I mean, those are just the pressures of life, but I don't, they seem daunting while you maybe haven't done it, yet, but it's also like it's like a leveling up of your life. And there's so many things that we approach in that manner. Like I'm sure there was at some point, right, when like you and Kim were both self-employed and you're like starting the family, and there's that like inherent pressure of like, we have to generate, this income for ourselves to provide for our family. That's different than if you just have like a 9 to 5. But now you've done that for whatever 7+ years now. Now it's just another fucking Monday. You know what I mean? But I think there is that to it. It's a little bit of pressure to perform, and it feels, you get some anxiety about it, but I don't think that that's objectively a bad thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I think it builds mental resilience and it kind of makes you stronger to have to push through that. Yeah, cool. All right, well, I want to sort of rearrange our syllabus here, and I'm going to save one of these things that I just moved to the end, and I think that we should jump to equipment access limitations, or just equipment selection might even be like a better way of saying that, exercise selection, in that it takes into account this idea of there being a huge difference between single joint movements that may or may not be short overloaded compared to big compound movements that are likely lengthened overloaded, and how that kind of impacts our volume. And so like we touched on this last week as well in the training volume over age, training age volume of volume over training age episode. But it is really relevant. Like you can't say that, doing 20 sets for quads is the best and you're doing all 20 sets of leg extensions, because that's a very different outcome than saying 20 sets of quads is the best and I'm doing all leg presses, hack squats, and split squats. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's relatively obvious. I don't know if we need to go super deep into it, but I'll let you kind of expand any thoughts you have there.
I mean, yeah, I think even within the length, and like, let's take a practical example, right? We're taking 6 sets of quads, right? Which is very digestible for almost anyone. We could split that up as like 4 sets on the leg extension and 2 sets on the leg press, right? We do like a top back off on the fuck's it called? Leg press. And we can do like a descending pyramid on the leg extension, right? 6 sets. Or you could do 6 sets of 8 with a barbell back squat. Like both are 6 sets of quads, but like the latter seems undiscernibly daunting. You know what I mean? Relative to the first example, which is like pretty straightforward. Doesn't really seem daunting at all. So it really does take into account lengthen versus short, but really actually loaded movements, and what you have access to. Because if someone's training in the garage and we have barbells and an adjustable dumbbell set, yeah, I don't think you can do a 1-to-1 on volume, because it's just not the same. It's not the same stimulus. It's not the same. This is where that mental kind of anxiety comes in. Like if we had that 6 sets of 8 on Wednesday as your leg day, holy shit, that sounds
Mm-hmm.
awful.
Yeah. So as a good coach or as a good trainee, somebody that's programming, whether it's for yourself or somebody else, you cannot separate out what you have access to and what your exercise selection is from what your volume needs are. And it seems like in the evidence-based space that oftentimes that seems to be like just the nominal recommendation is like, 10 to 20 sets at like 0 to 2 RIR and like you're good. And so, yeah, I mean, when I look at the majority of studies that assess this, and there are so many studies done on quads because they're a relatively easy muscle to, take muscle biopsies or to ultrasound or whatever, to kind of measure muscle thickness. You do look at the evidence-based programs that people are going through, and they usually do have a mix of some leg extension with some bilateral pressing. And so I would say that's like the most common combination. Like I think there was a study where they had them doing like 4 sets of leg extensions, 4 sets of lunges or split squats, 4 sets of Smith squats or back squats, and then 4 sets of leg press. So you're looking at like a 16 set per week quad workout where 4 of them are leg extensions and the other 12 are lengthened overloaded. And so that's on the higher end of what I think would be considered reasonable for a quad focused week of training. You'd likely split that into 2 sessions of 8 sets each, where you do, leg extensions and leg press on one day, and then maybe it's split squats and back squats on another day or something along those lines. And that's pretty reasonable, but you are talking about having 12 sets of lengthened movements in there for quads. And so I do think at that point, you now have to mitigate effort in some way. Like you're not doing all of those 12 lengthened sets over the course of the week to failure. That would leave you in a heap of mess where you're not really able to recover and make significant progress week to week. And so, if that was different and it was 8 sets of leg extensions and 8 sets of lengthened quad pressing, I think that changes the game a little bit. Now you can think about maybe taking even the lengthened movements closer to failure because you have 8 sets of short overload movement as well, which is going to be significantly less damaging. So looking at the whole picture of your exercise selection in your program can help give you insight into how close to failure you need to train given your volume, or do I need to reduce volume, change out some exercises so that I can work closer to failure if that's kind of the way that you want to go about organizing your trainings.
Yeah, I think that's, incredibly valid.
Cool.
Where did you plan to go next?
I was going to let you kind of talk about nutrition a little bit.
Okay, that's what I was hoping we were going to do. And this is one that of course, I get frustrated about it. Like nutrition is my bread and butter. It changes so much. If we have someone who's inherently under eating or they restrict during the week because of stress levels with work, whatever, and then they like obviously overconsume from a day-to-day standpoint over the weekends versus someone who's like structured, covering their bases really well, eating, separating into 4 evenly distributed protein intakes throughout the day. Like it really does change. And they understand, hey, I'm running a moderate to higher training volume. I'm going to put myself in like a gain or a little maintenance plus sort of thing to make sure there's adequate calories to recover. Like it really does impact the quality of your recovery and therefore how you may respond to a given volume. Whereas at a certain volume, let's call it that same 16 sets per week, you may not be recovered enough if your if your nutrition is all over the place or the quality is poor or micronutrients are not paid close attention to. But if we do things that then upregulate the quality of the recovery that you can achieve because of the quality of the food, the volume of the food that you're putting into your body, like we may be having a different discussion. And that very thing that I just stated, 9 times out of 10, this conversation is not even brought up, which blows my mind. It always blows my mind. And I think it's really, really important to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of almost, like from my perspective at least, feel that the total calorie amount is likely even more important than like the quality of the food that you're putting in your body, because it's going to dictate whether you're in a caloric surplus and are building muscle and creating anabolism versus not, being in a deficit and, being in catabolism, breaking down muscle tissue. And there used to be this kind of sentiment in the space. I think it was pushed by kind of RP and Israel, and I feel like they've sort of changed their statement here, but it kind of used to be a few years ago, this idea that when you're in deficit, you need more volume because you have to give your body a stimulus to hold on to muscle, or else you're going to lose muscle as you diet. And I think now that's sort of shifting. And I know like you and I are both on the side of like, look, if you're in a deficit and your energy availability is lower, you're not going to add volume and do more work. You're going to double down on working harder and being more focused and getting more out of the work that you have because your recovery resources are lower. So yeah, kind of like, do you want to discuss on that at all, where you stand on that equation?
Yeah, 100%. What I do personally, what I do with clients is try to maintain training performance. That is a very good marker. And I tell them like, we're in like week 4 of your diet. You should still be able to progress, right? Because I'm not starting people off at a 35% deficit or something like that. Like we're starting just enough to get the needle moving at the target rate of loss we want. You should be able to still progress your training once we get into the deficit. You may not progress at the rate you were at peak build, but we should not be regressing 4 weeks in. Once we get into like weeks 12, 16, 20, especially with lengthened overload movements, especially chest pressing, I'm like, hey, we're trying to hold on to our performance with everything that we got. In week 1 of the diet, if we were using, let's say, the 80-pound dumbbells for 8, we're probably going to be around the 6 reps now, maybe a 5 rep on like a bad day, but we want to try and hold on to that training performance. And I really like to say, if it's 5 reps and above, I'm okay keeping the load. If anything drops under 5 reps, dump the load to like the next dumbbell size down, but try to maintain that training performance. So I think that's where I stand pretty firmly. And one thing I wanted to circle back on in the nutrition, calories are important, assuming that you're not kind of grossly misdistributing things. If someone's following like a keto diet and we're running like 16 sets of legs, anything that's like higher than like 10, 12 reps, I wouldn't recommend that, because obviously like, carbohydrate is fueling glycolytic movement, glycolytic modalities. But assuming you're not doing any kind of like really weighted distributions and we're, a decent across the protein, fat, and carb, yes, the overall caloric load would have the highest importance.
Yeah, making sure you're getting enough protein at a minimum. Yeah. That's kind of the way I look at it too, is like, look, if you're in a deficit, just hit whatever the protein minimum is. And then, like obviously higher quality food is going to keep you more full. But at the end of the day, like if you're hitting protein and calories, that's going to be the thing that moves the needle the most, at least, until you get to the point of the diet where you're so depleted that you really do need those higher volume foods. And we have plenty of episodes on dieting. So, yep, people can go back and check those out. Anything else to add on the nutrition front?
Not nutrition or it's not nutrition at all, but I think it's really related. Sleep quality, sleep duration. It is when we recover, duration being the most. They're both important, but duration is something I would try to work towards most, and then, trying to button up quality. Maybe I should change my mind. I think quality is easiest to change quickest, because oftentimes duration is relegated to schedule. Like if you can only sleep 6.5 hours with your demands, like that's what we can do, but we can try and improve the quality of that 6.5 hours, and then trying to push into the duration. But this is another one I think people just grossly overlook, and I am so guilty of this. My sleep was horrendous through my 20s, like literally through my entire 20s, even early parts of my 30s. I'm really only now just figuring out really quality sleep, after 35 years old. And it has it impacts so much. Like when you wake up in the morning and you don't feel good already, and it's, fucking 7 a.m., it's gonna be a rough day, and that does really carry over into your training performance and recovery capacity, especially when you're a natural athlete. And that's because when you're producing those hormones when you're sleeping, that growth hormone secretion, like when you're sleeping, like it's really, really important. And I think similar to the nutrition, it's one that just gets completely glossed over, never spoken about, but has a profound impact, both, positively or negatively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find one night of relatively poor sleep mostly just impacts my motivation to train, but doesn't really have an impact on how my session goes once I'm in there. But like, yeah, if it's chronic and there's multiple nights of poor sleep in a row, that's not just going to affect your motivation, but it's going to have direct impact on all the aspects that go into quality training, recovery, and all that sort of stuff. But I do think that sleep conversation actually, is very related to, we'll call it, other lifestyle factors. And so I think that's kind of the right place to take this conversation now is the general bucket of stress and how that impacts your volume needs or what you can actually recover from optimally with a dose of volume. And so stress is a huge one. Like, how much time are you spending in front of a computer sitting there each day and not giving your body a chance to like move and kind of be resilient? Because I think the more you move, the more resilient you are. If you're stuck at a desk all day, that doesn't really set you up optimally necessarily. Obviously, I don't mean to say that you need to be moving all day like a hunter-gatherer, because that's also not going to put you in an optimal state to recover from your training. So I do think there's definitely a fine line there, but I think you need to move more than 3,000 steps a day of sitting at a computer and then walking to the bathroom and walking to bed and doing it all over again. And Aaron's like, yeah, that's what I do. So, but I do think having some movement is important. It almost, like, in my feeling, it almost kind of greases the joints and like sets the body optimally in a state to feel like movement isn't a foreign bacteria that's being introduced to your body. Like, hey, we're born to move. Like, let's move, so that moving isn't this foreign thing. But like, stress can come across in so many ways as a parent having kids. I remember I was much more stressed out like 2 years ago because one of my kids just really wasn't behaving well, and we couldn't wrap our heads around how are we going to get him to act like a normal human. Like, I mean, he's just acting like this terrorist controlling our house. And so every night it would be like we would enter our evening in a state of stress, just wondering when he was going to blow up. And so that's a stress. And then there's like work stress, and there's having to drive the kids to school and back and get them ready for school and making sure they're not leaving their jacket and their snow pants at school. And I mean, like, there's so many things that are coming into your brain and consuming you from so many different levels that it all goes into the same bucket of like, how much do I really have now to give to my training with all of these other inputs that I'm trying to deal with. And so being very self-aware, tallying up the things in your life that are causing you stress and aren't contributing to recovery, they're really like these opposite buckets. How have you kind of seen that?
It's massive. And I think the irony in it is the people who have the most stress want to then go train a lot to reduce the stress, because that's how they've compartmentalized it, or people talk about it. Oh, like the gym is my stress reliever. Like, it's one of those things that's like generally accepted at like a consensus, but it's completely a falsity. Like, training is a stressor on the body. It is a physical stressor. You just enjoy it, so it may not inherently feel like a stressor, because the other stressors in your life, like your job or God forbid your family, like you may hate, and you don't hate the gym, but like, let's be clear, the gym is a stressor. It is a object physical stressor. And yeah, I mean, that's a big thing of what I do with clientele is like, okay, well, what stresses are just going to be there and there's nothing we can do about them, or which ones can we like start to work on? And I think that plays a very big role into your like training volumes, right? And into the reality of where this particular meso or training season of your life fits in. Like you may be realistically, as much as I hate to say this, in a season of life where you're just going to train to hold on to what you have. And that is a victory in and of itself, right? Because of these other things. Maybe you're starting a new business that you're bootstrapping and like money's incredibly tight and those sorts of things. Like that could be that's a very, very realistic reality. And I think it's something that people underestimate, and then their progression is dog shit, and then they get frustrated and don't realize that they're just literally stretched too thin, and they're just asking, their expectations are too much of their given circumstances.
Yeah, and then maybe if they would have been training with lower volumes or lower frequencies or both, maybe they would be able to progress because they're not exceeding what their capacity is.
Yep.
I also want to just bridge this quickly to two things that I've found reduce stress. And so that would be a breathing practice of some sort. I've talked about this on the podcast before, but in the morning and then usually once in the afternoon, I just kind of sit on the couch where I work and I take 5 to 10 minutes and I just close my eyes and I focus on my breathing. And I feel like that really levels out what could be like an erratic heartbeat. Like sometimes in the middle of the day when you're just like this machine, like working at the computer, I feel like even though I'm not on Adderall, I feel like how I would feel like if I'm on Adderall, I'm just like typing away on the computer, like grit face, just like punching keys. And then suddenly I'm like, oh my God, like I feel such in disarray right now. Like I need to center myself. And so, sitting down and taking 5 minutes and just focusing on my breathing, like really kind of helps regulate me a little bit. And the other thing is zone 2 cardio. And so this is a tough one because if you're already limited on time, then being like, hey, you need to do this cardio so that you can reduce your stress, it kind of seems like a bit of a slap in the face. So I just talk about it from my perspective, in that when I do feel any sort of stress in my life, like taking an hour and going out and going and pedaling the bike and doing some kind of low intensity cardiovascular exercise, I come back feeling like a new person and just a completely renewed sense of self, motivation, vigor, vitality, all of these things. And so it's tough. Like it really just depends on what your schedule allows. But I do find the breathing practice and the zone 2 cardio to be, for me, something that's sort of irreplaceable in balancing everything in life that comes at me.
Yeah, I in full transparency, I don't have any of those things in place. There's a quote, and I'm gonna botch it, so I kind of don't even want to say it. But they say like it's something along the lines of like a lot of an overpowering amount of work like without purpose is called stress, and then that same exact thing but with like a purpose is called like passion or something along those fucking lines or whatever. And that's kind of where I find myself. Like I've said this to Jenny numerous times, where I kind of committed to like now through the end of the year, I want to see how much I can stack on my plate and get done. I kind of, there's a word, what is it? Positioning, maybe? It's like a kind of a concept. And I think, and like a story that I'll tell myself was like, what you have on your plate now is nothing. It pales in comparison to what it's going to be like when we have a family too. So like you got to figure it the fuck out. And that helps me to be like, this is nothing. In like a year and a half, there's going to be a fucking little one that I need to like dedicate family time to and stuff. Like what I have on my plate is nothing right now. So I kind of like anchor against that a little bit. But I also think too, is it's like a kind of like I said, that like leveling up, I've really begun to look at my life as just like a series of like skilling and up leveling to see how good I can get at things. And that's really changed the perception of how they are. And that's been fun, I feel it sometimes, but I feel like it's building towards a purpose that I think is worthwhile building towards, as opposed to just like slaving away to make it to the next Monday sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I love that quote. I'm gonna have to look up what that exact quote is, because that definitely resonates with me. And
I definitely botched it too.
No, it's cool. Like I got the idea, and like I totally get it. Like when you're so passionate about something that you're just thinking about it and it's on your mind all the time, it is its own sense of reward to pour yourself into it. And if you're not passionate about something and you're just like doing admin work that you hate doing, then that's going to have a completely different effect on you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have to bounce here in a minute, so I think we need to wrap up with subjective senses of pump, soreness, and fatigue. These are kind of the old RP Israel markers that he would use. Like when you would ask him, what's your training volume need to be? Like literally those would be the three that he'd go to. He'd be like, are you getting pump? Are you getting a little bit sore? And do you feel some fatigue after you train? And so those are pretty good ones. I think the things we went over prior are probably more important than those three, but I do think that those three are relevant. And so, if you're training and you're doing so little volume that you don't even get a pump in the muscle group that you're training, then you're either not doing a great job of connecting with your muscle or you're not doing enough volume. And it could be both. I can honestly say that I can do one set of bicep curls and be like, oh my God, my biceps. Whereas 20 years ago, I don't think I could do that the way that I can now. So there's an element of training age in there, but whatever you're doing to stimulate your muscle, like there should be a pump if you're training in hypertrophy rep ranges and that muscle is susceptible to pump. Hamstrings are kind of a weird one. Like you don't really get a pump in your hamstrings. They just kind of feel like they're like ripping apart and it's uncomfortable.
Awful.
But that's kind of like the same idea, like of I'm creating a stimulus, so to speak.
Yeah.
Soreness is a good one too. I actually really like soreness because too much soreness tells you that you likely did too much, and no soreness likely tells you that you didn't do enough, depending on the muscle group. And so there's a certain caveat there. And then a little bit of soreness, like you kind of wake up the next day or 2 days later and you're like, yeah, I feel like, a little bit of tightness in that muscle that I trained. I can tell that I worked it. That's likely a pretty good sweet spot of where you would want to be for volume and stimulus for a muscle group. And then, like after you do a leg session, you should feel fatigue in the sense that you struggle to walk up the stairs or down the stairs. You're like, oh shit, gotta like kind of balance myself here. I'm like surfing on the stairs. So I do think you need to feel that. Like if you did a really hard shoulder and back workout and then you go to shower immediately afterward, it shouldn't feel just completely normal to like raise your arm up and wash your hair. You should be like, oh yeah, that feels like I just trained my shoulders and back. So there are those kind of subjective senses of, did you get a sufficient stimulus in your workout? And so pump, soreness, and immediate post-session fatigue, I think, are in the target muscle group are good proxies to kind of assess whether your volume is sufficient.
Yeah, the post training fatigue is arguably my favorite. I also like the day second, either next day or second day. Everyone's a little bit different. A little bit of soreness, like, oh, I can feel like I trained that. I really, really like that one. The pump is, I would say, nutrition plays a role in that. If you're deep in a calorie deficit, your pumps are probably going to be trash unless you're using all sorts of pump tools and those sorts of things. And that one may not be a great gauge at that point. I've just had numerous clients be like, my pumps are shit. Does that mean I'm losing muscle? I'm like, no, you're only eating 150 fucking grams of carbs a day. That's a problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point to bring up the nutritional periodization along with the pump, because that the pump, I think for that reason is probably less reliable than the soreness and the fatigue, but also important to remember that if you're in a caloric deficit, you're likely going to get more sore. So you do kind of have to keep in mind the mitigating factor of nutrition on those variables as well.
Yep. Very, very well put.
Cool. That's all I got.
Yeah. So, I mean, I like this. It was an episode on the deciding factors, right? As opposed to like, you should do 6 if, you should do 8 if, because I don't like when people present information like that, because there's no context and nuance to it. And unfortunately, the answer to this top level question is chock full of context and nuance, and it's going to vary from person to person, even within yourself, based on the different seasons of life and other things that we covered in the episode. So, as always, guys, thank you for listening. Next week, Brian and I will be back with a topic that we do not yet know about.
Right.
Know what it is. We'll know about it. We just don't know what it is yet. I almost left